There is a moment in this story where a school bus stops on a quiet rural road, and a woman steps down, believing she is about to remove a sign meant to humiliate her child. Inside a small metal box tied to a rope, there is a loaded gun. It is rigged to fire. The question is not just who built it. The real question is why, after this moment, the letters did not stop. For years before that day, someone in Circleville, Ohio, had been writing letters that seemed to know everything. Private affairs, hidden conflicts, details that should not have belonged to a stranger. And yet, the author never showed their face. To understand how a town arrived at a roadside trap armed with a handgun, we need to step back into the social machinery of Circleville in the 1970s. Because this was not simply a mystery of handwriting. It was a slow, methodical collapse of trust inside a very small world. Circleville was the kind of town where visibility was unavoidable. People worked where their neighbors could see them. Children rode buses driven by familiar faces. Schools were not just institutions, but centers of social power. In places like this, reputation is not abstract. It determines who is trusted, who is believed, and who is quietly pushed to the margins. By the mid-1970s, the local school system represented one of the most influential structures in the community. Its superintendent was not merely an administrator. He was a public symbol of authority, morality, and stability. One of the people who moved through this system every day was Mary Gillespie. She was a school bus driver, a job that placed her at the intersection of families, children, and daily routine. That visibility would soon become a liability. The first letters arrived quietly. No return address, typed or block-lettered handwriting. Short sentences that cut directly to accusation. They accused Mary of having an affair with the superintendent, Gordon Massey. They did not ask questions. They stated conclusions. At first, the letters framed themselves as warnings. Stop, confess, end the relationship. And if that did not happen, the letters promised escalation. This is where the nature of the Circleville letters becomes critical to understand. They were not written to solve a crime. They were written to control behavior. The author did not seek recognition. They sought compliance. That distinction matters. Soon, the letters did what they were designed to do. They expanded their reach. Mary was no longer the only recipient. Her husband, Ron Gillespie, began receiving letters as well. These letters spoke to him directly. They framed him not as a victim, but as a lever. They demanded that he make his wife stop. They implied that if he did not act, consequences would follow. In small communities, pressure rarely needs to be explicit. The threat is embedded in social exposure itself. And then, something happened that would permanently alter how these letters were understood. On August 19, 1977, Ron Gillespie died in a car accident. Officially, it was just that, an accident. But context changes interpretation. Friends and family questioned whether Ron had been drinking. Some insisted that alcohol levels reported later did not align with his habits. Others focused on timing. He had been under relentless pressure, letters accusing, letters threatening, and now he was gone. There was no formal conclusion connecting his death to the letters. But in Circleville, causation does not need legal proof to feel real. From this moment on, the letters were no longer harassment. They were something closer to menace. Instead of stopping, the letters intensified. They began appearing in unexpected places, on bulletin boards, in public areas, sometimes referencing events that had not yet occurred. They also began targeting new people, teachers, officials, anyone perceived as morally compromised. The author positioned themselves not as a criminal, but as an enforcer. This pattern reflects a deeper cultural mechanism. In tightly bound communities, anonymous accusation can function as a parallel justice system. It bypasses courts. It bypasses due process. It relies entirely on fear of exposure. By the early 1980s, the Circleville letters had become a defining anxiety for the town. People speculated openly about who could know so much, and who would care enough to keep writing. Then, in February of 1983, the letters crossed a boundary that could not be ignored. Mary Gillespie was driving her bus route when she noticed a sign posted along the road. It contained a crude message aimed at her daughter. Instinctively, she stopped. The sign was attached to a rope, The rope led to a small box. Mary did something that likely saved her life. She did not pull it apart on the roadside. She took the box with her. Inside was a firearm, a pistol rigged as a trap. This was no longer psychological pressure. It was an attempted killing. Law enforcement moved quickly. The Ohio Bureau of Criminal Investigation examined the device. The serial number on the gun had been partially removed, but not completely. They traced it to a man named Paul Freshour, a local resident, a relative by marriage. Freshour admitted the gun had once belonged to him. He claimed it had been stolen months earlier. There were no fingerprints tying him to the box, no eyewitnesses placing him at the scene, but suspicion had found its anchor. Investigators also focused on the letters themselves. Freshour was asked to provide handwriting samples. This process would later become one of the most controversial aspects of the case. He was instructed to copy phrases, to imitate letter forms. Critics would later argue this blurred the line between comparison and contamination. In October of 1983, Paul Freshour went to trial, not for writing letters, but for attempted murder. The letters were allowed into the courtroom as context, dozens of them. They painted a picture of obsession, of moral fixation, of someone who would escalate when ignored. The jury convicted Freshour. He received a sentence that could keep him in prison for decades. To many, the case was closed, but one problem remained. The letters did not stop. They continued while Paul Freshour was behind bars, sent to the same town, with the same voice, the same accusations. This contradiction would fracture the narrative and raise a question that still has no universally accepted answer. If the man convicted was not the writer, who was? And if he was, how did the letters continue? The continuation of the letters after the conviction created a problem that could not be dismissed as coincidence. Because once Paul Freshour was incarcerated, the Circleville Letters should have ended. Instead, they adapted. Freshour was sent to a state correctional facility with regulated mail procedures. Incoming and outgoing correspondence was logged. Addresses were recorded. Mail was screened. From an investigative standpoint, this should have created a closed system. Yet letters bearing the same tone, the same fixations, and the same knowledge continued to reach Circleville. This is where the case fractures into competing explanations, each with consequences that ripple far beyond this one town. One explanation was simple and deeply unsettling, that Freshour was still sending them. This theory relied on the assumption that prison mail controls were imperfect, that letters could be routed through third parties, that friends, family, or sympathizers could act as intermediaries. But prison officials pushed back on this idea. They stated that outgoing mail was monitored, that no suspicious volume was detected, that no accomplices were identified. A second explanation emerged, that there had always been more than one writer. This reframes the entire case. If true, the letters were not the work of a lone individual, but of a shared grievance, a collective enforcement of moral norms, a distributed campaign. This theory explains something the first does not. How the letters seem to know different things at different times. How their focus shifted across targets. How escalation could continue even after an arrest. But it also raises a darker implication. That multiple people in Circleville were willing to terrorize their own neighbors anonymously. There is a third explanation, often dismissed, but persistent in public memory. That the wrong man was convicted. This argument does not claim Freshour was innocent of all wrongdoing. It claims the evidence never rose above circumstantial inference. Consider what the conviction rested on. The gun was traced to Freshour, but he claimed it was stolen. No fingerprints tied him to the trap. No eyewitness placed him near the sign. And the letters themselves were never the subject of a separate charge. The handwriting analysis, often cited as persuasive, was not conclusive in a scientific sense. Graphology can suggest similarity. It cannot establish authorship beyond doubt, especially when the sample collection method risks bias. What this creates is not proof of innocence. It creates ambiguity, and ambiguity is corrosive when a community wants closure. As years passed, the letters became less frequent, but no less unsettling. They referenced past events. They hinted at ongoing observation. They suggested the author, whoever they were, was still present. By the late 1980s and early 1990s, attention turned to Paul Freshour's eligibility for parole. This is where the letters produced one of their most tangible effects. They were cited as a reason to deny release. The logic was circular. Letters continued, therefore the threat continued. The threat continued, therefore Freshour remained dangerous. Whether or not he was writing them became secondary. In 1994, after more than a decade in prison, Freshour was granted parole. Shortly after his release, something changed. The letters stopped. For some, this confirmed his guilt. For others, it proved nothing. Because correlation is not causation. The cessation of the letters could mean the author achieved their goal. It could mean fear subsided. It could mean the writer aged, moved, or died. Or it could mean that the social conditions that sustained the campaign no longer existed. This brings us to the deepest layer of the Circleville Letters case. It is not only about identity. It is about function. The letters worked because they exploited a specific environment. A town where reputation was currency, where silence was interpreted as guilt, where accusation alone could punish. Once that environment changed, the letters lost their power. The author did not need to be caught. They needed to be rendered irrelevant. Today, the Circleville Letters are often framed as a whodunit. But that framing misses the broader lesson. Anonymous terror does not require genius. It requires proximity. It requires access. And it requires a community structured around fear of exposure. The case remains unresolved in the way that matters most. No definitive author. No final confession. No evidence that closes every contradiction. What remains is a pattern of escalation, of silence, of consequences that extended far beyond paper and ink. And that is why the Circleville Letters endure. Not because we do not know who wrote them, but because we recognize how easily they could happen again. If you want to support deep investigations like this, consider liking the video and subscribing to the channel. And in the comments, ask yourself and others one question. In a town where everyone knows your name, how anonymous can cruelty really be?